Welcome everyone, my name is Sylvester, and in this video lesson we will be focusing on human body cavities. Please remember to support this channel by clicking on the like button, subscribing to the channel, and sharing content on this channel to family and friends. Now let's move on to human body cavities. Human body cavities are fluid-filled spaces that protect and enclose the body's internal organs. So when we say human body cavities are actually fluid-filled spaces in the body that protect and encloses the body's internal organs. In fact, human body cavities are there in the body with the help of the skeletal system. Okay, we have the skeletal system and other structures that help to create or demarcate these fluid-filled spaces in the body. Okay, and these spaces actually help to enclose some of the body's internal organs. Okay, so this is what this video is basically going to focus on. Now, we have major cavities in the body. The major cavities in the body, they are actually divided into two. So the body can be divided into two major cavities. Okay, and these are dorsal cavity and then the ventral cavity. Okay, so the whole human body, the whole human anatomy can be divided into two major cavities: the dorsal cavity and then the ventral cavity. Okay, so this is what we are talking about. So the whole human body can be divided into two major cavities: the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal cavity from the cranial cavity down to the spinal cavity. Okay, so this is what we call the dorsal cavity from this side. So from the part that is colored orange. Okay, so from this side to this side. So the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity together forms the dorsal cavity. So this is the dorsal cavity from this side down to this side. This is the dorsal cavity. So from the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity, they forms the dorsal cavity. Okay, and then we have what we call the ventral cavity. So the ventral cavity from the thoracic cavity, okay, down to the abdominal cavity together forms the dorsal cavity. So largely enough, the body can be divided into two cavities. Remember this. Okay, the dorsal cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity, and then we have the ventral cavity, which consists of what? The thoracic cavity and then the abdominal cavity. Okay, good. So we have the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal cavity consists of the cranial cavity, the cranial cavity, and then the spinal cavity. Okay, the spinal cavity. And then we have the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity actually consists of the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal cavity. Okay, in fact, the abdominal cavity can also be further divided into two. We have the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, the abdominal cavity can further be divided into the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So together we call it the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so let me go over it again. So the body can be divided into two major cavities: the dorsal cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity. This is the spinal cavity, the one you see as a line running behind the abdominal cavity. So the cranial cavity plus the spinal cavity together forms the dorsal cavity. And then we have the ventral cavity. So the ventral means anterior, in front. Okay, like we said previously. So the ventral body cavity actually consists of the thoracic cavity, this side, the thoracic cavity, and then the abdominal cavity. Abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so the abdominal pelvic cavity is actually made up of the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Okay, good. Let me go over it for the last time. So the body is divided into two major cavities. We have the dorsal cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity. And then we have the ventral cavity, which consists of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity can be further divided into abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Okay, if you come here, we have the same thing over here. So this is the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and then the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. Okay, we have the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and then the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. Then we have the ventral cavity, which consists of the thoracic cavity, which houses the ribs and the heart, and then the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity can further be divided into the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So this is the pelvic cavity. It's part of the abdominopelvic cavity. So the ventral cavity can further be divided into thoracic cavity, which houses the made up of the ribs and houses the lungs and then the heart. And then we have the abdominopelvic cavity, which can also be further divided into abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So what you should remember is that the pelvic cavity is part of the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is also part of the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity plus the abdominopelvic cavity all forms part of the ventral cavity. So largely enough, the ventral cavity is very broad, and at the ventral cavity we have the thoracic cavity and then the abdominopelvic cavity. And under the abdominopelvic cavity, we have the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Okay, so we have the body can further be divided into two major cavities, the dorsal cavity and then the ventral cavity. Under ventral cavity, we have thoracic cavity and abdominopelvic cavity. Under abdominopelvic cavity, we can further divide it into abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Then the dorsal cavity can be further divided into cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. These are the two major divisions of body cavities we have. Okay, so we have the cranial cavity. Okay, so the dorsal body cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity and then the vertebra. Fine, you should remember that in some books they call it vertebral cavity instead of spinal cavity. It's the same thing. So either you call it a cranial cavity or cranial cavity and vertebral cavity, or cranial cavity and spinal cavity. So you see that spinal or vertebral cavity, all of them are accepted. The thoracic cavity. Okay, so the thoracic cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity, and then the pelvic cavity all forms part of the ventral body cavity. Okay, so the ventral body cavity consists of the thoracic cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity, and the abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Now, you should know that the thoracic cavity can also be further divided. Within the thoracic cavity, we have other sub-cavities, other sub-body cavities within the thoracic cavity. For example, we have what we call the pleural cavity, which specifically houses the lungs. The pleural cavity. This is the pleural cavity. This, the pleural cavity. This, the left pleural cavity, the right pleural cavity. That is where we can find the lungs. And then we have the mediastinum. The mediastinum. Okay, the mediastinum. And that is where we can find the heart. The mediastinum. Okay, just in between the lungs, but a little closer to the left lung. Okay, the mediastinum. And that is where the heart is located. We have the pericardial. Okay, within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity within the mediastinum. Okay, so this region is where we call the mediastinum. And within the mediastinum, we have a portion of the mediastinum we call the pericardial cavity. And all this is within the thoracic cavity. So within the thoracic cavity, fine, if you are describing the location of the heart, for example, you can say the heart is within the thoracic cavity, but specifically where? Where exactly is the heart? The heart is within the pericardial cavity, which is situated within around the area of the mediastinum. Okay, good. So if you are talking about the location of the heart, more specifically, it is within the pericardial cavity. And all these are within the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity can further be divided into the pleural cavity where the lungs are. Okay, and then the pericardial cavity. So we have the pleural cavity over here, and then we have the mediastinum. Okay, and within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity. Okay, within the mediastinum. Good. The same way, the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be divided into the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So, in summary, the human body cavities, we have two major human body cavities. The dorsal body cavity, which consists of the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and then the vertebral cavity or the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. And then we have the ventral body cavity. Okay, the ventral body cavity, which consists of the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be divided into abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. Okay, good. So this is the lateral view, and this is the anterior view. And then the thoracic cavity can further be divided into pleural cavity, okay, and then the mediastinum. And within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity where the heart is located. Okay, so these are the human body cavities, the divisions of the human body cavities. And now, to add to this, you should know that these body cavities, we have specialized fluids that are actually located within or found within these body cavities for reasons that we will talk about as we go further in anatomy and physiology. Okay, good. Now, so we now know the dorsal body cavity. So the dorsal body cavity is a fluid-filled space in the human body that protects the brain and the spinal cord. So this is the dorsal body cavity. Okay, so the dorsal body cavity is a fluid-filled space. Okay, good. A fluid-filled space in the human body that protects the brain and then the spinal cord. Okay, so the dorsal cavity actually houses the brain and the spinal cord. So in an exam, if you are asked to talk about the dorsal body cavity, the dorsal body cavity consists of the cranial cavity and then the vertebral or spinal cavity. They are actually fluid-filled spaces that houses the brain and then the spinal cord. And then we have the ventral body. So the subdivisions of the dorsal body cavity, we have the cranial cavity and the spinal or vertebral cavity. Is that okay? Good. That is fine. That is fine. And one of the things you should know is we have meninges. Okay, the membrane around this cavity. Okay, we have 3 layered membranes surrounding both the brain and the spinal cord that protects cushioning for the structures that forms this cavity. Okay, so before this cavity, we have membranes, okay, that protects the brain and the spinal cord before these cavities. We call those membranes meninges. Okay, we can have a condition where these meninges will get inflamed, and we call that meningitis. Okay, so we have the brain over here. The brain is not lying directly in these cavities. There is a membrane that protects the brain before it lies in this cavity. We call that membrane the meninges. Okay, it's the membrane surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. The membrane surrounding the brain and the spinal cord before they lie in their specific cavities. We call that the meninges. Okay, the meninges. That should tell you not only the dorsal body cavity, all the other cavities, we have membranes that lines the outside of the various organs within the cavities to serve as a cushioning or protection for those organs. Good. Then we have the ventral body cavity. The ventral cavity, like I said earlier, can be divided into the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we mentioned that the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be divided into the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So the thoracic cavity is part of the ventral body cavity. Okay, and I explained earlier on that the thoracic cavity can further be divided into pleural cavity. Okay, the pleural cavity. That is the cavity that houses the lungs. And then we have the mediastinum. And we mentioned that the mediastinum can further be divided. Okay, can further be divided. So the mediastinum, we have the upper mediastinum and we have the lower mediastinum, where by we can find the pericardial cavity. So the pericardial cavity is actually located within the mediastinum, and that is the cavity that encloses or houses the heart. Okay, it houses the heart. Okay, good. So we have, when you hear of pleura membranes are membranes that actually lines the rib cage. Okay, this pleural cavity, here is it. This pleural cavity here is actually the ribs. Okay, the rib bones that are forming this pleural cavity. The lungs do not lie directly in this cavity. There should be a membrane lining this cavity before we have the lungs within it. Okay, now the membranes that lines the rib cage, we call it the parietal pleura. And the membrane that actually covers the lungs itself before they lie in the parietal pleura, we call those membranes the visceral pleura. In fact, we mentioned in the descriptive terms that when you hear visceral, meaning it is related to an organ. So anytime you see the word visceral, meaning that membrane has got to do with closeness to a certain organ. Visceral means something that is related to an organ. Okay, so visceral pleura, it covers the surface of an organ. So visceral pleura covers the lung surface. Visceral meaning it covers the lung surface. Okay, the parietal meaning is closer to a cavity. Parietal is closer to a cavity. Okay, good. So it lines the rib cage. So when you see parietal pleura, is the membrane of the lungs that lines the rib cage. So this membrane is more like a carpet that is laid within the rib cage before the lungs itself, with its outermost membrane, visceral pleura, comes to lie in it. That's the visceral pleura. Okay, good. So the pleural cavity actually is a fluid-filled cavity that actually houses the lungs. The mediastinum is actually the central area of the thoracic cavity, the central area. Okay, and we have the pericardial cavity within the mediastinum. Okay, and within the mediastinum, just as the pleural membrane, we have membranes that lines the pericardial cavity. So we have the parietal pericardium, which actually lines the inside of the parietal cavity, and we have the visceral pericardium, which covers the outermost surface of the heart before it lies in the pericardium, the parietal pericardium. And then we have the pericardial cavity. Okay, the pericardial cavity is filled with pericardial fluid to reduce friction. So within this cavity, okay, we have a fluid there, we call it the pericardial fluid. Within this pleural cavity too, we have a fluid there, we call it the pleural fluid. Okay, and they have their right proportions. Okay, so within this cavity, which is the pleural cavity, we have a fluid there, we call it the pleural fluid. Okay, good. So within the pleural cavity, we have a fluid there, we call the pleural fluid. Within the pericardial cavity, we have a fluid there, okay, which serves as a form of cushioning and reducing friction. We call that fluid the pericardial fluid. Good. Then we come to the ventral body cavity. So like I said earlier, the ventral body cavity actually consists of the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity. So now we are going to look at the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity actually consists of the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. So it has two divisions, the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains the digestive organs, including the kidneys and then the spleen. It also includes the kidneys and then the spleen. Kidney is not part of the digestive organs, but then the abdominal cavity actually consists of the digestive organs, the kidney and the spleen. Then the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is where we have the urinary bladder, the reproductive organs, and distal part of the large intestine. Okay, so the ventral cavity consists of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Okay, the thoracic cavity consists of the pleural cavity, the mediastinum, which also include the pericardial cavity, and we have the pleural fluid in the pleural cavity, and then we have the pericardial fluid in the pericardial cavity. When you come to the abdominal pelvic cavity, okay, which is the second portion of the ventral cavity, it is further divided into two: the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Okay, now we have membranous lining the abdominal cavity. We call it the peritoneum. It is made up of a serous membrane. It's moist and a serous membrane. Okay, so just as we have the parietal pleura, and I explained that parietal meaning something that lines in the cavity. When you come to the abdominal cavity too, we have the peritoneum. Is the name given to the membrane that lines the inside of the abdominal cavity. So when you hear parietal peritoneum, meaning this membrane actually lies in the inside of the cavity. It serves as a carpet lining the inside of the cavity. And then we have the visceral peritoneum. The moment you see viscera, meaning this one has contact with the organ itself. The parietal, and this covers the surface of most of the organs. So most of the abdominal organs, we have the visceral peritoneum covering most of the abdominal organs. Okay, and then the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneal cavity basically contains most of the abdominal organs. Peritoneal cavity. Within the peritoneal cavity, okay, we have a fluid, a lubricating fluid. We call it the peritoneal fluid. The peritoneal fluid. Okay, the peritoneal cavity is actually within the abdominal cavity. This peritoneal cavity is actually not all the organs in the abdominal cavity are within the peritoneal cavity. So what you should know is that this peritoneal cavity is within this abdominal cavity. The peritoneal cavity more specifically houses the digestive organs. Okay, and not all the organs within the peritoneal cavity are also within the abdominal cavity. Like the kidney, for example, is a retroperitoneal organ, meaning it is behind the peritoneum. It's not within the peritoneum. Okay, good. So we have a peritoneal cavity which is within the abdominal cavity. This peritoneal cavity actually contains a fluid we call the peritoneal fluid. The peritoneal fluid. Okay, good. So like I said, retroperitoneal organs that are located behind the peritoneum. So let me go over it again. With a ventral body cavity, we said the ventral body cavity can further be divided into the thoracic cavity, which is one, and the second is the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity can further be divided into two, the pleural cavity and then the mediastinum. And the mediastinum, within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity. Okay, and I said that within these cavities, we have membranes that sort of serve as a carpet lining the inner of the cavities before the organs are laid within it. Okay, those membranes, we usually refer to those membranes as parietal. But then the membranes, if we are talking about membranes in the lungs, we call it pleura. You can't call it membranes. We use the word pleura. So if you hear parietal pleura, meaning the membrane that lines the inner of the pleural cavity. If you hear visceral pleura, visceral in anatomy means something that is related to the surface or an organ. So anywhere you see visceral, meaning we are talking about a membrane covering an organ. So when you see visceral pleura, this is the membrane that covers the lungs before they lay inside the parietal pleura. When you go to the heart, it's the same thing. So when you see parietal peritoneum, if you see pericardium is the name given to the membranes when we are dealing with the heart. Anytime you hear pericardium, we are talking about, we are referencing membranes that have to play when we are talking about the heart. So when you see parietal pericardium, by virtue of this word parietal, we are talking about a membrane that lines the inner of the cavity. Which cavity are we talking about? The pericardial cavity. Okay, and when you see visceral pericardium, meaning we are talking about a membrane that is surrounding the heart as an organ itself. And then within this pericardial cavity, we have a fluid there. We call it the pericardial fluid. And within the pleural cavity, we have a fluid we call the pleural fluid. The same thing applies to the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is the second portion of the ventral body cavity. Abdominal pelvic cavity consists of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic. This abdominal cavity, within the abdominal cavity, we have the peritoneal cavity. And this peritoneal cavity actually contains a fluid we call peritoneal fluid. Okay, good. So, and I said that when we come to the abdominal pelvic cavity, membranes in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we call them peritoneum. So when you hear parietal peritoneum, we are talking about a membrane that lines the inside of the abdominal cavity. And when you hear visceral peritoneum, a membrane that is covering most of the abdominal organs. That is what we are trying to say. Okay, good. So like I was saying, the major body cavities, these are the major body cavities and some fluids that we can find in these major body cavities. And the name of membranes that play major roles in these major body cavities. So the major body cavities, we mentioned that we have the dorsal body cavity and then the ventral body cavities. These are the two major body cavities, the dorsal body cavity and then the ventral body cavity. And we mentioned that the dorsal body cavity can further be divided into the brain or cranial cavity. It can be divided into cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and then vertebral or spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. Okay, good. And then the membrane that plays major role in the dorsal body cavity is the meninges. These meninges are actually the membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord before they lie in the dorsal body cavity, the meninges. Okay, we have a special fluid within this dorsal body cavity. We call it the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so if they ask you a fluid that can be found in the cranial cavity, cerebrospinal fluid, a fluid that can be found in the vertebral cavity or spinal cavity, we call it the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Okay, so the vertebra, we can also call it a canal. The cranial canal is the same as the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity, or we can call it the spinal canal or the vertebral canal, is the same as spinal cavity. Within it, we have the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid. Then we have the ventral body cavity. The ventral body cavity, like we said earlier, consists of the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we mentioned that the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be divided into abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Within the abdominal cavity, we have the peritoneal cavity, which contains the peritoneal fluid. Okay. Within the thoracic cavity, we have the pleural cavities, which are two. We have the mediastinum. Within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity, where the heart is located. And the upper portions of the mediastinum is where we can locate the esophagus and the trachea. Okay, good. And the membranes that play a role there, around the lungs, we have the pleura, where we have the parietal pleura, which lines the inner of the cavity, and then the visceral pleura, which covers the lungs, the outer surface of the lungs. Okay, then we have the pericardium, then we have the parietal pericardium, which lines the inner of the parietal cavity, the pericardial cavity, and then the visceral pericardium, which covers the heart. Okay, and around these cavities, we have the pericardial fluid, the pleural fluid, the peritoneal fluid. Okay, so anywhere you hear peritoneal fluid, link it to peritoneal cavity. And peritoneal cavity is within the abdominal cavity, which is part of the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is under ventral body cavity. Okay, so this is it for human body cavities. Okay, so in summary, we have two major human body cavities: dorsal body cavity and then ventral body cavity. And the dorsal body cavity, we have the cranial body cavity and the vertebral or spinal body cavity or vertebral or spinal body canal. Then the ventral body cavity, under the ventral body cavity, we have the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Okay, the thoracic body cavity can further be divided into pleural cavity and then the mediastinum. Within the mediastinum, we have the pericardial cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity can further be divided into abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. Within the abdominal cavity, we have the peritoneal cavity. And we have CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, in the dorsal cavity. We have the pleural fluid in the pleural cavity. We have the pericardial fluid in the pericardial cavity and peritoneal fluid in the peritoneal cavity. This brings us to the end of human body cavities. Thank you so much.